Clara Bennett would remember that moment for the rest of her life. Melissa Rhodes stood frozen in front of the flow meter screen, her eyes locked on the numbers plunging downward. "That's impossible," she whispered. Less than 3 minutes earlier, the water source had still been flowing strongly enough to sustain an entire farm. Now the flow was dropping so fast it was as if someone had just opened a gigantic door underground and swallowed the entire spring whole. Melissa suddenly spun around, her voice ringing across the field. "Shut it down. Shut it down now." A technician sprinted toward the main valve while the needle on the gauge kept falling notch by notch. If they did not lock it immediately, the pressure in the aquifer could collapse, and the spring they had spent years finding risked being destroyed forever. No one thought that could happen, especially not Clara Bennett. But everything had begun 3 years earlier, on a cool late April morning in the Smoky Hills of Kansas. Clara, 42 years old and a widow for 2 years, stepped down from an old pickup truck with a cashier's check for $5,500. That was the entire life insurance money her husband had left her, along with her last savings. If she failed, she would have no chance to start over. Walter Hayes signed the quitclaim papers, almost as if he wanted to get the land off his hands. He shoved the folder toward Clara and sighed. 38 years, he said. Nobody ever beat this place. The whole county knew its history. 38 years of failed crops. Wells going dry before summer ended. Alkali soil bleached white and cracked like old pottery. 3 successive owners had given up. People no longer called it by the name on the map. They simply called it the White Field. Clara put the papers in the truck. Just as she was about to start the engine, her gaze stopped on the eastern hillside. Across the entire silver-white field ran a thin strip of green grass, curving along the slope like a thread. Walter followed her look. He gave a short laugh. "Funny thing about that strip." Clara turned back. "What?" Walter shrugged. "It stays green even in August." He paused, then added, "Nobody ever figured out why." After Walter left, Clara walked toward the strip of grass. Her late husband, Ethan Bennett, used to say that the land always speaks before it changes. Most people just never spend enough time listening. She knelt and scooped up a handful of soil. Only a few steps away, the ground was white and dry as ash. But in her palm, the earth under the green strip was soft and moist. Her fingertips immediately felt a quiet coolness rising from below. Then she noticed something even stranger. The strip of grass did not run down into a low area the way any natural rainwater drainage would. Instead, it climbed silently up the slope, winding several times before disappearing among the limestone outcrops at the highest point of the property, as if it were following something hidden deep underground that human eyes could not see. There was no sound of water, only a quiet life existing in a place that should have died years earlier. Clara stood still for a long time, watching the green strip vanish behind the distant limestone ledges. That night, in the old wooden house where only the wind slipped through the cracks, she opened the notebook that had belonged to her husband. The first page was still blank. She wrote a single line. "What is this land trying to tell me?" Clara did not yet know that the green strip had not appeared by chance. It was the only remaining trace of something that had been quietly existing beneath this land for decades. And only a few years later, that very thing would make the most experienced engineers stare at the flow meter in astonishment before shouting, "Shut it down!" In the first 6 weeks after moving to the White Field, Clara Bennett did not plant a single seed. She did not dig a well, did not hire a tractor, and did not try to prove to anyone that she had been right to buy the place. Every morning, before the sun cleared the limestone hills to the east, She carried Ethan's old leather notebook, a soil thermometer, and a few glass jars and walked. Day after day, Clara only watched and listened. Ethan had once told her that a single sign might be coincidence, but when three unusual things appeared together in one place, it was no longer chance. That was how the land spoke. The first sign was 4 cottonwood trees growing tight against a rock crevice near where the green strip changed direction. The second was a flock of meadowlarks that always landed on those same rocks at every dawn and vanished before the sun rose high. The third was the prairie verbena flowers that kept blooming for weeks after the rest of the field had withered. Clara began measuring soil temperature. At midday, when the white surface soil burned under the Kansas sun, the ground under the green strip was always 6 to 8 degrees cooler. On rainless mornings, dew still clung to the leaves while the grass only a few steps away was already brittle and dry. She also discovered that the limestone outcrops ran in a winding line and then suddenly disappeared under the alkali soil. Cottonwoods, meadowlarks, wildflowers, cool earth, lingering dew, and limestone. 6 separate signs. But when Clara marked them all on the same map, they began to overlap inside a narrow corridor crossing the farm. It was no longer just a strip of green grass. It looked like the trace of something existing underground. Earl Dawson did not believe it. He owned the neighbouring farm and had watched 3 generations of the Carter family fail on this very land. One afternoon, seeing Clara drive wooden stakes around the outcrops, Earl stopped his truck at the fence and laughed. "The Carters lost 40 years here," he said loud enough for both of them to hear. "You're going to lose 41. When Clara stayed silent, he shook his head. "The land doesn't need another dreamer. It needs rain. And you can't buy that for $5,500. Clara did not answer. She only recorded the wind direction, soil temperature, and the positions of the marker stakes. But that night, when she opened the old wallet, she counted and recounted the money left. After repairing the roof, replacing the generator, and paying the first bills, she had less than $9,000. That sum would cover only 3 exploratory drill holes or seed for a final crop. She could not do both. If the drilling failed, she would enter winter empty-handed. If she planted the way the others had, she would most likely repeat the 38 years of failure of the white field. The next morning, Clara decided to bet on the signs she had recorded for weeks. The first drilling crew was called in. The bit was set right beside the cottonwood cluster, where the soil was coolest and the grass grew thickest. Earl stood on the other side of the fence watching from start to finish, 20 feet 40, 60, 80. When the bit was pulled up, white rock dust poured down like chalk powder, covering the well mouth. Not a drop of water. No one spoke. The crew chief simply pulled off his gloves, and the silence after the engine died was louder than when it had been running. Earl looked at Clara for a few seconds, then got in his truck and left without another word. Clara stood still beside the dry hole, feeling as if every week of observation had just been buried with the rock chips at her feet. But when she examined the core samples, she noticed tiny fractures and dark mineral streaks running through the limestone. They had not produced water at that spot, yet they proved that water had once passed through. The signs had not been wrong. Perhaps she herself had read them wrong. That night, Clara spread every map and notebook across the table and then quietly folded them away again. For the first time since buying the farm, she thought about quitting. Maybe Earl was right. Maybe the white field was simply a $5,500 mistake. As she reached to put Ethan's notebook on the shelf, a folded sheet of paper fell to the floor. It was the first sketch she had drawn in the opening week before any measurements existed. On it, she had accidentally marked the change of direction of the green strip with a small arrow. Clara opened all the other maps and compared them. For the first time, she connected the positions of the cottonwoods, the meadowlarks, the wildflowers, the cold soil, the dew, and the limestone line. None of them led to the place they had just drilled. They all converged on a narrow patch of ground among the highest limestone blocks in the northeast of the farm, a place no previous owner had ever drilled because everyone believed the solid rock there could not hold water. Clara stared at that intersection point for a long time. If she was wrong, by next spring the white field would no longer belong to her. But if she was right, then for 38 years, everyone had misunderstood this land from the very beginning. Clara barely slept that night. The small dot on the old map, lying right among the limestone blocks, kept appearing every time she closed her eyes. It was the first time she wondered whether she was trying to force the land to tell a story that had never existed. The next morning, while making coffee in the old kitchen, her 13-year-old daughter Lily set her cup on the table and asked very softly, "Mom, do you think Dad would have bought this farm?" Clara did not answer at once. She looked out the window toward the white field beyond. Ethan had always believed every piece of land had something to say. But he was also a man who weighed every dollar before placing a bet. If he was still alive, would he have used the last of their money to buy a place the whole county called hopeless? Clara did not know. She only smiled at her daughter. But when Lily turned away, the smile vanished. For the first time since setting foot on the white field, the thought of selling the farm crossed her mind. She opened Ethan's notebook once more. Every page was dense with the notes of the past 6 weeks, soil temperatures, wind directions, elevations, bird landing spots, blooming times. She read each line more slowly than before, trying to see what she had missed. Then she took out the old aerial photographs the county office had lent her. The 1978 photo looked ordinary. But when she laid the 1961 photograph beside it under the lamp, Clara suddenly stopped. On the older image, a faint curved line ran across the property, beginning on the eastern hillside and disappearing among the limestone outcrops. In the later photographs, that curve had vanished completely under years of ploughing and erosion. Clara placed the photo next to her own marked map. The green strip, the cottonwoods, the meadowlarks, the wildflowers, the cold soil, the limestone, all of them lay exactly along that vanished curve. She was no longer seeing scattered signs. She was seeing the trace of a system that had once existed. The very next morning, Clara drove to the office of Dr. Melissa Rhodes, a hydrologist who had worked nearly 30 years in the Smoky Hills region. Melissa looked through the notebook and set it down. "I've heard hundreds of theories like this," she said. "Most of them end with a dry well." Clara did not argue. She simply laid the 1961 photograph on the table. Melissa leaned closer. She took a pen and traced the old drainage line, then compared it with the cottonwood positions on Clara's map. For the first time, the skepticism on her face slowly gave way to curiosity. "If everything you've marked is accurate," Melissa said slowly, "then we haven't been looking for water at the wrong depth. We've been looking in the wrong place." 2 days later, a survey team from Kansas State University arrived with a ground-penetrating radar system. The scanning vehicle moved slowly along the corridor Clara had marked. On the screen, curved bands of color appeared and then abruptly broke off under the limestone. Afterward, the technicians took the first geologic core samples: alkali soil, claystone, and then a fractured limestone layer riddled with countless small intersecting fissures like a spiderweb. Melissa stared at the cause for a long time. "Fractured limestone," she whispered. "Those fractures did not hold water like a lake. They conducted it." When the radar data were matched with the surrounding topography, the team realized that rainwater from the eastern hills had for years not been flowing across the surface the way everyone thought. It had been seeping down into the limestone fractures and moving silently underground along a natural recharge path before changing direction at the exact place Clara had marked. That was why the green strip did not run downhill into a low area, but climbed back up the slope. Every sign was pointing to the same place. Melissa closed the folder and looked at Clara. "If there is water," she said, "this is the only place worth trying." That afternoon, the drill rig was brought to the patch of ground among the limestone blocks that no one had touched for 38 years. The bit cut through the white soil, then the hard clay stone. No one spoke. 60 feet, 80 feet, 90 feet. When the bit reached the fractured limestone, the operator suddenly signaled to stop. Everyone looked down into the pipe. At first, there was only a very small sound, like water dripping onto rock inside a sealed cave. Then a few seconds later, the water's surface began to rise inside the steel casing. No pump, no artificial pressure. Only cold water slowly climbing by itself out of the darkness underground. Melissa looked at the gauge and then at Clara. "We just proved a real groundwater system," she said quietly. But none of them knew the most important thing. Was the water source large enough to sustain the white field for years, or was it only a small pocket that would empty the moment it was exploited? For the next 3 days, no one called it a spring. Melissa Rhodes insisted everyone use a more cautious name, a natural discharge point. They measured the flow early in the morning, at midday, and after sunset. They lowered the water level in the casing and watched how quickly it recovered. Each time, the cold water slowly rose up again from the fractured limestone without any pump. By the end of the week, Melissa finally allowed Clara to enlarge the well mouth and install a test pipeline. The water moved down the hillside by the natural elevation of the land itself, flowed into a small holding tank, and then spread into the first irrigation furrows. There was no diesel engine noise, no electric wires, only the steady sound of water running through steel pipe, a sound so simple it almost did not seem real on the white field. Clara stood beside the tank for a long time on the day the first flow was opened. She bent down and dipped her hand into it. The water was cold enough to numb her fingertips. Ethan had once said that some things in life do not come when people become stronger, but when they are willing to stop long enough to look in the right place. Clara did not know whether he would truly have bought this farm, but for the first time she believed he would understand why she had done it. News spread through the Smoky Hills faster than any crop. The first person to return was Walter Hayes. He parked his old truck by the fence and walked toward the new pipeline. His silver hair was blown into disorder by the wind. Both hands held his hat against his chest. He did not look at Clara at once. He looked at the water flowing into the tank. "I've driven past this place for nearly 40 years, he said. "Every summer, I watched that strip of grass stay green while everything around it died." He stopped and shook his head. "I thought it was just a tease." Clara did not tell him he had been wrong. She did not tell him she had been right. She simply handed him a cup of water, taken straight from the pipe. Walter drank a sip, looked out over the white field, and said very softly,
"Maybe this land never gave up on us.
Maybe we gave up on it first." The first planting season began late. Clara did not try to save the entire farm. Following Melissa's advice, she chose only 12 acres lying on the lowest slope, where the gravity-fed system could work without creating extra pressure. She planted sorghum, alfalfa, and a small strip of corn near the house. The water was guided along shallow furrows, slow and steady. Every morning, Clara measured the flow before opening the valve. Every evening, she recorded the water level in the observation well. In the first few weeks, the plants grew sparse and short. But by mid-June, the sorghum rows began to green the soil that had once been white as ash. By July, people driving past the fence often slowed down. Some stopped completely. Earl Dawson no longer laughed the way he used to. He stood by the road, looked at the rows of plants swaying in the wind, and asked Clara where she was pumping the water from. "No pumping," she answered. "It flows by itself." Earl looked up the hillside, then toward the pipeline. "No water is free," he said. Clara knew he was right, but at that moment she did not yet understand how right the words were. At the end of summer, the white field harvested its first living crop in decades. Not a large harvest. Not enough to make Clara rich. But enough to pay part of the debt, buy seed for the next year, and prove that the land could produce if it was given water the right way. When the first truckload of sorghum left the farm, Lily stood beside her mother, both hands dusty with grain. "Dad would have liked this," the girl said. This time Clara did not stay silent. "Yes," she answered. "I think he would have. That should have been the happy ending." But success created a new kind of pressure. Buyers wanted more yield. The bank offered a loan if Clara expanded the acreage. 2 neighbouring farms asked whether she could sell them a share of the water. Every day Clara looked at more than 100 acres that still lay white outside the irrigated zone. She began to believe she had been too cautious. The water level still recovered after every valve opening. The flow remained steady. The numbers in the notebook had never dropped enough to cause worry. Early the next spring, Clara installed an additional branch pipeline running toward the southern field. Melissa opposed expanding too soon. She wanted another full year of data to determine the exact recharge rate. Clara agreed to monitor carefully, but she still opened the valve. 20 acres became 35, then 42. New rows of corn appeared. Alfalfa covered ground that once could not hold weeds. People in the county began calling the place by Clara's name instead of the white field. A local newspaper ran a photograph of her standing beside the pipeline with the headline, "Widow finds water beneath farm everyone abandoned." Clara read the article twice and then folded it away, not realizing that at that very moment, the victory had begun to turn into something more dangerous. The first sign was so small she overlooked it. On a June morning, the water level in the observation well was 2 inches lower than the day before. It recovered by evening, but more slowly than usual. A week later, the moist soil around the rock crevice began to shrink. Clara recorded the number and kept irrigating. Rain had been scarcer than the year before. She decided it was only the weather. By the end of the month, the 2 smallest cottonwoods began curling their leaves at midday. The prairie verbena wilted 3 weeks early. The meadowlarks no longer gathered on the rocks at dawn. Melissa arrived one unseasonably hot morning with new flow measuring equipment. She checked the main pipeline, the observation well, and the wetland around the green strip. Then she asked Clara to close one irrigation branch for 2 hours. The water level recovered, but only a fraction of what it had the previous year. Melissa took the measurement again, then a 3rd time. Clara stood behind her, feeling the familiar cold that had once settled in her chest beside the first dry well return. "How much have we taken?" she asked. Melissa did not answer at once. She walked toward the rock crevice. The soil that had been soft under the green strip was now hard at the outer edge. A cottonwood taller than a person already showed its first yellow leaves in the middle of July. "The water hasn't disappeared," Melissa said, "but it's recovering slower than the rate you're taking it out." Clara looked at the green fields stretching below. That was what she had fought to create. The first harvest, the debts paid. The proof that the whole county had misunderstood this land. But every surviving row of plants out there was drawing water from the system that had kept the green strip alive for decades. Clara had saved the farm. The question now was whether she was killing the very thing that had saved it. Melissa turned back to the flow meter. The number had just dropped once more. She looked at Clara, then at the technician standing beside the main valve cluster. Her voice was not loud, but no one could misunderstand it. "Shut it down." Melissa did not allow any valve to be reopened for the next 3 days. The sorghum and cornfields lay under the July sun, their leaves beginning to curl at the edges, while Clara stood beside the observation well, watching the water level recover in tiny increments. Every hour that passed had a cost. 1 day without irrigation could reduce the yield. 3 days could ruin the entire crop. But Melissa was not looking at the plants. She was looking at the numbers. She measured the depth of the water table, the recovery rate, and the flow through the fractured limestone. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she spread the data sheets across Clara's kitchen table and drew 2 lines with a pencil. One line was the amount of water Clara had been taking each day. The other was the amount the system could replenish by itself. "This is the recharge rate," Melissa said. "The speed at which rainwater from the uplands seeps into the limestone and returns to the spring." Clara looked at the 2 lines diverging across the page. "So we just wait for it to fill back up?" Melissa shook her head. "It's not a tank. This is a moving system. Water takes weeks, sometimes months, to travel from the recharge zone to here." She placed the tip of the pencil at the point where the 2 lines began to separate. "You found the place where the water rises, but you still haven't learned how slowly it comes back." Clara was silent. Melissa continued explaining the water balance. If the amount withdrawn stayed below the amount replenished, the spring could survive. If the 2 amounts were equal, the system would only barely stay alive. But if extraction exceeded the recharge rate for many months, the water table would keep dropping, the wetland would shrink, the cottonwoods would die, and the fractures carrying the water could lose their natural pressure. Clara looked out the window at the green fields she had spent nearly 2 years creating. "How much do I have to shut off?" she asked. "At least half the irrigated acreage," Melissa answered. "Maybe more." That meant Clara would have to abandon nearly the entire southern cornfield before harvest. She would lose the money already invested in seed, fertilizer, and pipe. The contracts to sell water to the 2 neighbouring farms would also have to be cancelled. The bank would not renew the expansion loan if yields fell. That evening, Clara walked between the rows of corn that reached her shoulders. The leaves brushed her arms as the wind passed through. This was the clearest proof that the white field had been misunderstood. It was also the very thing she'd had to sacrifice to keep the spring alive. The next morning, Clara locked the Southern Irrigation Branch. She called each person who had signed a water purchase contract and returned their deposits. Then she used a mower to destroy nearly 15 acres of corn before the plants could tassel. Earl Dawson stood by the fence, watching the dust rise behind the tractor. "I told you," he said when Clara stopped. "No water is free." Some people in town said harsher things. They claimed Clara had exaggerated the discovery to borrow money. Others said the spring was only a small pocket she had nearly pumped dry. The newspaper that had once called her the saviour of the white field now ran a new article with the headline, "Hidden Spring Fails to Deliver." Clara did not reply. She spent the autumn repairing the system. Melissa and the survey team traced the recharge path back toward the uplands nearly 3 miles from the farm. They discovered an area of exposed limestone where rainwater soaked in faster than anywhere else. Clara used the remaining money to lease the right to protect that land from chemical dumping and grading. Around the spring, she removed a section of the old pipeline, expanded the wetland, and replanted switchgrass, big bluestem, and other deep-rooted native species to hold the soil and slow surface runoff. Instead of continuous irrigation, she divided the farm into 4 zones. Each zone received water only on designated days. A shallow holding pond was dug at the lowest point to store water at night when irrigation demand dropped. Clara shifted most of the acreage to sorghum, millet, and drought-tolerant forage grasses. Corn remained only in a small strip near the house. For the first 3 months, the water level barely changed. Clara recorded every eighth of an inch in Ethan's notebook, even when the numbers stood still for weeks at a time. After 6 months, the cottonwoods stopped dropping leaves early. Prairie verbena returned along the edge of the wetland. One spring morning, Lily saw 2 meadowlarks land on the old rock. By the end of the year, the water level in the observation well stood nearly 14 inches higher than its lowest point. Not enough to call a full recovery, but enough for Melissa to allow part of the system to be reopened. This time, Clara did not open valves by feeling. Every gallon was recorded. Every field had a limit. At the end of the season, the spring still flowed, the wetland remained moist, and the young cottonwoods began putting out new leaves. Clara finally understood what finding the water had never taught her. Discovering a resource does not mean people have the right to take everything it can give. Success does not lie in making the whole farm green in a single season. It lies in keeping the water source alive through the seasons still to come. But the real test had not yet arrived. The system had only been restored during a year of near-average rainfall. Melissa still did not know how it would respond if the recharge zone stopped receiving water for many months. In the second summer, the answer began to appear. May brought only 2 light rains. In June, the clouds passed without leaving a drop. By July, the sky above the Smoky Hills was a frightening clear blue. Not a single cloud remained. By mid-July, people were calling it the worst drought in 30 years. The western grasslands turned a grey-brown. Stock ponds shrank to small mud holes. Pumps on neighbouring farms ran from before dawn until midnight, yet many wells still dropped faster than the water they could pull up. At the Whitefield, Clara did not try to keep everything green. She kept the system alive. Every morning, before opening a valve, she measured the water level in the observation well, checked the flow, and recorded every number in Ethan's notebook. The irrigated zones were rotated by day. No field received more than the allotted amount. The sorghum received priority. The corn strip near the house was cut by half. The holding pond was filled only at night when evaporation was lowest. Clara managed every gallon as if it were the last, because she understood that if the spring fell out of balance, it would not be only one crop that disappeared. The entire system might never return to what it had been. Early in August, Earl Dawson drove to the farm. This time he did not stop at the fence to laugh. He stepped down slowly, hat in hand, his sunburned face more tired than Clara had ever seen. His southern well had dropped below the reach of the pump. 2 wheat fields were dead. The cattle herd had less than a week of water left. "I need help," he said. No excuses, no reminder of what he had once said. Clara looked toward the green strip around the wetland. The water level was still stable, but the margin of safety was not large. If she shared too much, she could repeat the old mistake. If she refused, Earl's herd might not survive the month. She opened the notebook, calculated how much water the spring could lose without exceeding the recharge balance, and offered a plan. Earl could take water on 2 mornings each week, with a clear limit. He had to use sealed tanks, repair every leak, and reduce the herd before the end of the month. Clara also opened a small distribution line for 2 other families, but no one was allowed to take water at will. The water was shared, not exploited. When August ended, many farms in the region had nearly lost their entire season. But the sorghum at the white field still stood. Earl's cattle survived. The 2 other families kept their most important forage fields. More important, the water level in the observation well dropped only within the range Melissa had predicted. The wetland did not shrink. The cottonwoods did not curl their leaves. When the first rains returned in September, the spring still flowed. Not stronger, not weaker, only steady. Nature had finally given the answer that no argument could replace. The system was right. A few weeks later, Walter Hayes returned. He stood beside the green strip that had made Clara stop the truck on the first day. This time, looking at the cottonwoods and listening to the quiet sound of water in the pipe, he smiled. "I thought this land took 40 years of my life," he said. "Maybe it was only waiting for someone who knew how to take less." Clara did not answer at once. She opened the soft, worn leather notebook that had survived many seasons of sun and wind. The first line was still there, never crossed out. "What is this land trying to tell me?" Clara had spent months learning where the water lay, but the drought had taught her something harder. How much water the land could afford to lose and still have enough left to keep living. Finding water requires observation. Keeping it alive requires restraint, because sometimes the land will reveal what it has been hiding. Wisdom lies in knowing how much to take without teaching it how to disappear. If Clara's story reminds you of a time in your life when everyone advised you to give up, but you still continued listening to the voice inside yourself, share that story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to keep exploring stories of perseverance, self-reliance, and the lessons nature only gives to those patient enough to listen.